You have spent your entire life believing that love means sacrifice, that being chosen by him is more important than choosing yourself, and that your worth depends on how much you can endure in the name of love. But what if everything you learned about relationships is actually a psychological trap designed to keep you small and available for people who cannot love you properly? Sigmund Freud discovered that the human unconscious contains patterns and drives that control our behavior in ways we never realize. And when it comes to women in relationships, these unconscious forces often lead us to abandon ourselves in pursuit of validation from men who are incapable of providing the love we truly deserve. What happens when you finally break these unconscious patterns and choose yourself over him will shock you, because it reveals truths about female psychology that most women never discover. Discovered that our earliest experiences with caregivers create invisible blueprints that control our adult relationships. If you grew up watching your mother disappear into relationships or felt you had to earn love through giving up pieces of yourself, this pattern became hardwired into your psyche. Your unconscious mind believes that choosing yourself means losing love, so it sabotages every attempt at self-prioritization. This is why, even when you know you deserve better, something inside fights against putting yourself first. The repetition compulsion that Freud identified means you unconsciously seek out relationships that recreate familiar dynamics of self-abandonment. You find yourself drawn to emotionally unavailable men, demanding partners, or situations where you must prove your worth through sacrifice. Your unconscious mind tricks you into believing this feels like love because it matches your earliest template of what relationships look like. The more you give up yourself, the more normal and right it feels, even as your conscious mind screams that something is wrong. This pattern runs so deep that choosing yourself feels foreign, selfish, and terrifying. When you finally break this unconscious sacrifice pattern, your psyche goes through what Freud called a form of therapeutic crisis. Your unconscious mind panics because you are disrupting its familiar operating system and changing the rules of how you exist in relationships. You may experience guilt, anxiety, or even physical symptoms as your psyche adjusts to this new way of being. But this disruption is actually your unconscious mind reorganizing itself around self-love instead of self-abandonment. The woman who emerges from this process is no longer driven by unconscious patterns of sacrifice, but by conscious choices of self-respect. Your superego is the internal critic that Freud identified as the harsh voice of societal expectations and internalized parental commands. For women, this voice is particularly vicious when it comes to self-prioritization, constantly whispering that you are selfish, ungrateful, or unworthy if you put your needs first. This internalized guilt system was programmed early in life through messages that good girls sacrifice, good girls don't ask for much, and good girls make everyone else happy before themselves. Your superego has convinced you that choosing yourself over him makes you a bad person, which is why even thinking about leaving or setting boundaries triggers overwhelming shame. The guilt feels so real and powerful that you mistake it for moral truth rather than psychological conditioning. The superego uses guilt as a control mechanism to keep you trapped in relationships and situations that drain your life force. Every time you consider choosing yourself, it floods you with shame, based thoughts about how you are hurting him, disappointing others, or being selfish and cruel. Freud understood that this guilt is not based on actual wrongdoing, but on internalized voices from childhood that taught you love requires self-sacrifice. The superego has you convinced that your worth depends on how much you can endure, forgive, and give up for others. This creates an internal prison where self-love feels like a crime and self-abandonment feels like virtue. Breaking free from the superego's guilt trap requires what Freud called making the unconscious conscious through awareness and conscious rebellion against these internalized commands. You must recognize that the guilt is not your authentic voice, but a psychological program designed to keep you small and compliant. When you choose yourself despite the guilt, you are not being selfish, but reclaiming your authentic self from years of conditioning. The guilt will scream louder at first because the superego fears losing control. But as you consistently choose self-respect over self-sacrifice, its power diminishes. Eventually, you develop what Freud would call a healthier ego that can distinguish between genuine moral concerns and psychological manipulation disguised as conscience. Your psyche has developed sophisticated defense mechanisms that Freud identified as unconscious strategies to protect you from painful truths about your relationships. Projection is one of the most common defenses, where you attribute your own unacceptable thoughts and feelings to him, convincing yourself that he needs you, that he would be lost without you, or that he is the one with the problems. This defense keeps you focused on fixing him, rather than facing the reality that you are choosing to stay in situations that diminish you. Denial works alongside projection, helping you minimize red flags, excuse unacceptable behavior, and convince yourself that things are not as bad as they seem. These defenses feel protective, but actually keep you trapped in cycles of self-abandonment. Rationalization is perhaps the most dangerous defense mechanism because it uses your intelligence against you, creating elaborate justifications for staying in situations that hurt you. Your mind becomes expert at explaining away his behavior, finding reasons why you should wait longer, try harder, or give more chances. You rationalize that he had a difficult childhood, that he is under stress, that he really loves you deep down, or that all relationships require sacrifice. Freud understood that rationalization feels logical and mature, but is actually your psyche protecting you from the terror of admitting you deserve better. The more intelligent you are, the more convincing your rationalizations become, which is why smart women often stay in the worst situations. When you choose yourself, these defense mechanisms fight back with increased intensity because they fear the collapse of the psychological structures that have kept you feeling safe through familiarity. Your mind may create elaborate scenarios of what will happen if you leave, projecting your own fears onto him and convincing yourself that you are responsible for his well-being. Breaking through these defenses requires what Freud called the courage to face reality without the comforting illusions that have protected you from painful truths. As you dismantle these defense mechanisms, you initially feel more vulnerable and anxious, but ultimately you gain access to your authentic perceptions and can make decisions based on reality rather than psychological protection strategies. Transference is Freud's revolutionary concept that explains why you keep attracting the same type of man in different packaging, unconsciously recreating unresolved emotional patterns from your past. In your romantic relationships, you are not just relating to him as he actually is, but projecting onto him the unfinished emotional business from earlier relationships, particularly with your father or primary caregivers. If your father was emotionally unavailable, critical, or abandoning, your unconscious mind seeks out partners who trigger these same feelings because your psyche is trying to resolve the original wound. You mistake the familiar pain of chasing unavailable love for genuine attraction and chemistry, not realizing you are trapped in a psychological time loop. The transference game keeps you focused on winning love from someone who cannot give it, just like you once tried to win love from caregivers who were emotionally limited or absent. Your unconscious mind believes that if you can finally get this unavailable man to choose you, love you, or commit to you, it will heal the original rejection and prove you are worthy of love. This is why you find yourself working so hard in relationships, trying to be perfect, accommodating, and indispensable to men who treat you as optional. Freud understood that transference makes you fall in love with your own projections rather than the actual person, which is why these relationships feel so intensely meaningful, even when they are clearly destructive. When you choose yourself over him, you break the transference pattern and stop using romantic relationships as therapy for childhood wounds. This requires recognizing that your intense feelings for unavailable men are not about love, but about unresolved psychological material being projected onto inappropriate targets. Choosing yourself means withdrawing your projections and seeing him clearly without the filter of your unfinished emotional business. The withdrawal of transference can feel like falling out of love or losing interest, but this is actually your psyche healing and your capacity for authentic love emerging. You stop being attracted to men who trigger your wounds and start being drawn to partners who can actually meet you in healthy relationship. Freud understood libido as your fundamental life force energy that drives creativity, passion, sexuality, and personal power. But when you pour all of this vital energy into chasing unavailable love, you drain yourself of the very force that should be fueling your own growth and desires. Your libido becomes fixated on him, obsessing over his moods, analyzing his behavior, and trying to decode his mixed signals, which leaves you depleted and disconnected from your own life force. This sexual and creative energy that should be flowing through your own goals, dreams, and self-expression gets trapped in circular patterns of hoping, waiting, and trying to win love from someone who cannot receive it. You literally give away your power by directing your most potent energy towards someone who does not value or reciprocate it. The libido fixation creates what Freud would recognize as a form of energetic bondage, where your life force becomes enslaved to another person's approval and attention. You find yourself unable to focus on your own projects, dreams, or pleasure because all of your mental and emotional energy is consumed by relationship anxiety and romantic fantasies. Your creativity suffers, your ambition diminishes, and your connection to your own sexuality becomes dependent on his desire for you rather than your own erotic autonomy. This is why women in toxic relationships often feel like shadows of their former selves, because their vital energy is being channeled away from self-actualization and into the futile project of earning love from emotionally unavailable men. When you choose yourself, you begin the process of withdrawing your libido from him and redirecting it back into your own life, which Freud called sublimation at its healthiest expression. This reclaimed energy floods back into your creativity, your sexuality, your ambitions, and your capacity for joy and pleasure that exists independent of romantic validation. You rediscover interests and passions that had been neglected, feel more alive in your own body, and experience a surge of personal power that comes from your life force serving your own growth rather than someone else's ego. The woman who reclaims her libido energy becomes magnetic, not because she is chasing love, but because she is fully alive and directed by her own authentic desires and creative expression. Freud identified two fundamental forces within the human psyche: the life drive that seeks growth, pleasure, and self-preservation, and the death drive that pulls toward destruction, stagnation, and return to an inorganic state. When you stay in relationships that diminish you, ignore red flags, or repeatedly choose men who cannot love you properly, your death drive is winning the internal battle by steering you towards psychological and emotional destruction. This self-destructive pattern disguises itself as love, loyalty, or hope, but underneath it is your psyche's unconscious desire to avoid the challenges and responsibilities that come with truly choosing life and growth. The death drive finds comfort in familiar pain because it requires no change, no risk, and no expansion beyond your current limitations. Your death drive whispers seductive lies about how staying small and accepting crumbs is easier than demanding the full feast of love and respect you deserve. It convinces you that leaving would be too hard, that you are too damaged for better love, or that this dysfunctional dynamic is the best you can expect from relationships. Freud understood that the death drive often masquerades as selflessness or devotion, making you believe that sacrificing your well-being for his comfort is noble rather than self-destructive. This force within you actually fears your own power and potential, so it keeps you engaged in relationships and situations that ensure you never fully realize what you are capable of becoming. Choosing yourself over him is your life drive finally, overpowering the death drive and directing you toward growth, expansion, and authentic self-preservation. Your life drive wants you to thrive, to experience genuine love, to express your creativity, and to build a life that reflects your true worth and potential. When you choose yourself, you align with the force within you that seeks pleasure, growth, and life-affirming experiences rather than the force that finds comfort in suffering and limitation. This shift from death drive to life drive dominance changes everything about how you move through the world, what you attract, and what you are willing to accept in relationships, because you are now operating from a place of expansion rather than contraction. Freud's Oedipal complex reveals how your earliest relationship with your father creates an unconscious template that drives your adult romantic choices, particularly your tendency to seek validation from men rather than developing internal self-worth. If your father was emotionally unavailable, critical, or absent, you developed what psychology now calls daddy issues, an unconscious compulsion to win love from father-like figures who withhold approval and affection. Your psyche remains stuck in childhood patterns where you believe that if you can just be good enough, perfect enough, or giving enough, you will finally earn the paternal love that was missing or conditional in your early years. This creates an addiction to male validation that keeps you trapped in relationships where you are constantly trying to prove your worth. The unresolved father wound makes you unconsciously attracted to men who recreate the dynamic of having to earn love through performance, sacrifice, and self-abandonment. You find yourself drawn to emotionally distant men, critical partners, or those who give you just enough attention to keep you hooked, but never enough to feel truly secure and valued. Freud understood that this pattern stems from the little girl inside you who is still trying to win daddy's love and approval, believing that romantic relationships are the place to finally heal this original wound. You mistake the familiar pain of chasing unavailable love for destiny or deep connection, not realizing you are trapped in a psychological loop that prevents authentic intimacy. When you choose yourself over him, you break the Oedipal pattern by becoming your own source of validation and approval, rather than seeking it from father substitute figures in romantic relationships. This means grieving the father love you never received and accepting that no romantic partner can fill that void or heal that wound through their attention and affection. Choosing yourself requires developing what Freud would call a mature ego that no longer needs paternal approval to feel worthy and valuable. You stop being attracted to men who make you work for their love and start recognizing that healthy love is freely given, not earned through self-sacrifice and performance. Freud understood the ego as the part of your psyche that mediates between your inner desires and external reality. But when you consistently abandon yourself in relationships, your ego becomes weak and underdeveloped, unable to protect your authentic self from external pressures and demands. A strong ego maintains clear boundaries between self and other, knowing where you end and he begins. But years of people-pleasing and self-sacrifice have created what psychologists call poor ego boundaries, where you lose yourself in his needs, moods, and expectations. Your underdeveloped ego cannot say no without guilt, cannot ask for what you need without shame, and cannot maintain your sense of self when faced with disapproval or conflict. This ego weakness makes you vulnerable to manipulation and keeps you trapped in relationships that require you to be smaller than you actually are. The process of choosing yourself is actually a process of ego development, where you strengthen your psychological boundaries and reclaim your right to exist as a separate, autonomous individual with your own needs, desires, and limits. Freud recognized that healthy ego development requires the ability to tolerate other people's disappointment, anger, or rejection without collapsing into self-abandonment or people-pleasing behaviors. When you start setting boundaries, you're weak. Ego will initially panic because it fears abandonment and conflict. But each time you maintain a boundary, despite discomfort, you strengthen your ego's capacity to protect your authentic self. This ego strengthening is what allows you to stay connected to your own truth, even when others pressure you to betray yourself. A woman with strong ego boundaries developed through choosing herself becomes immune to the manipulation tactics that once controlled her behavior, because her ego can now distinguish between genuine love and conditional acceptance based on compliance. Your strengthened ego recognizes that anyone who cannot respect your boundaries is not capable of authentic love, and that relationships requiring you to abandon yourself are not relationships worth having. Freud would say that this ego development is the foundation of psychological maturity, where you can love others without losing yourself and receive love without betraying your own needs and values. The ego boundaries you develop through choosing yourself become the container that holds your authentic self and attracts relationships based on mutual respect rather than unconscious neediness. Deep within your unconscious lies what Freud recognized as the suppressed feminine psyche, the parts of your authentic self that have been buried under layers of conditioning about how women should behave, what they should want, and how they should exist in relationships. Your feminine unconscious contains your raw desires, your untamed sexuality, your fierce boundaries, and your capacity for pleasure that exists independent of male approval or validation. Years of prioritizing his needs over your own have created a split between your conscious people-pleasing persona and your unconscious authentic self, leading to depression, anxiety, and a sense of living someone else's life. When you consistently abandon yourself for relationships, you are essentially betraying and silencing the powerful feminine force within you that knows your worth and demands respect. The feminine unconscious awakening happens when you stop suppressing your authentic desires and start honoring the voice within you that has been screaming for recognition and expression. Freud understood that repressed psychological material always seeks expression, and your suppressed feminine power will continue to create symptoms, relationship problems, and internal conflict until you give it permission to emerge. This awakening often feels scary because your authentic feminine self is not concerned with being liked, approved of, or considered nice by everyone, but rather with living authentically and experiencing life fully. Your unconscious feminine wisdom knows that you deserve passionate love, respect, and partnerships where you can be fully yourself without apology or performance. When the feminine unconscious awakens through choosing yourself, you connect with an ancient power that exists beyond the conditioning and programming that taught you to be small and agreeable. This awakened feminine energy is magnetic, creative, and unapologetically authentic, drawing to you people and experiences that match your true frequency rather than your performed version of acceptability. Freud would recognize this as the integration of previously unconscious material that creates wholeness and psychological health. The woman whose feminine unconscious has awakened cannot be manipulated or controlled through guilt, shame, or fear, because she is connected to her own inner authority and trusts her authentic desires more than external opinions about how she should live. Freud's concept of sublimation describes the process of redirecting sexual and emotional energy from destructive or unfulfilling outlets into creative, productive, and life-enhancing activities that serve your highest growth and expression. When you are obsessed with an unavailable man or trapped in a draining relationship, all of your passionate energy gets channeled into the futile project of trying to make him love you properly, which is a form of psychological masturbation that produces no real satisfaction or growth. This misplaced energy that should be fueling your creativity, career, friendships, and personal development instead gets wasted on analyzing his behavior, waiting for his attention, and trying to solve the puzzle of his emotional unavailability. Sublimation allows you to take this same intense energy and redirect it toward goals and activities that actually enhance your life rather than diminish it. The process of sublimating relationship energy requires recognizing that your obsession with him is actually misdirected passion that belongs in service of your own dreams and authentic self-expression. Freud understood that sexual and romantic energy at its core is creative life force that seeks expression. And when it cannot find healthy outlets in reciprocal love, it can be channeled into artistic pursuits, professional achievements, physical fitness, spiritual practices, or social causes that align with your values. The same intensity you once directed toward winning his love can be redirected toward building the life you actually want, developing your talents, and creating relationships that truly nourish you. This sublimation transforms you from someone who chases love into someone who creates a life so fulfilling that love becomes an addition rather than a necessity. When you successfully sublimate your relationship energy through choosing yourself, you discover that the passionate intensity you thought was about him was actually about your own unlived life, seeking expression through the only outlet you allowed it. Your redirected energy creates momentum in areas of your life that had been neglected while you were focused on romantic drama, and you begin to experience the deep satisfaction that comes from pouring your life force into activities that actually generate growth, success, and authentic fulfillment. Freud would recognize this sublimation as a sign of psychological maturity, where your energy serves your evolution rather than your compulsions, making you magnetic to healthier love because you are no longer desperate for it, but are instead overflowing with your own creative power and life satisfaction. Now you understand what Freud knew about the female psyche and why choosing yourself over him is not selfish but essential for your psychological health and authentic happiness. The question is, are you ready to disappoint the little girl inside you, who still believes love requires sacrifice, and start living as the powerful woman you were meant to be? Subscribe to discover more truths about your unconscious mind and how to use psychology to create the love and life you actually deserve.